Sophia sighed, rolling her eyes as she adjusted the strap of her purse. The light from the overhead lamp cast a dull glow across her face, making the disdain in her expression even more evident. She looked at Jake across the small table, her words about to spill out like they had been rehearsed 100 times. "I just need more excitement," she said, her voice flat but cutting. She fiddled with the edge of her napkin, pretending to be focused on anything but him. "You're great, Jake, but you're just boring." Jake's chest tightened as the words hit him. He had known this was coming, but it still stung. She had been distant for weeks now, her attention drifting, her gaze slipping past him as if he no longer mattered. The man who had been there for her through thick and thin, who had given everything he could to make their relationship work, was now being cast aside like an outdated piece of furniture. He had always been steady, reliable. He worked hard, kept his promises, and never needed drama to feel alive. He liked things simple, just a quiet evening, a good meal, a few laughs. But to her that wasn't enough. She wanted fireworks, adventure, spontaneity. And Jake, with all his calm and composed nature, could never be that for her. "Look, Jake," Sophia continued, her voice softening as she reached for her purse. "You're a good guy, really. But you're just not what I need right now. I need someone who can keep up with me. Someone who's exciting." Jake looked at her for a long moment, trying to read her face, trying to understand if this was really happening. Was she really leaving him for this? For something that didn't even make sense? Her eyes flickered toward the door, the excitement of her next big adventure already tugging at her, and he realized then, without a shadow of doubt, that this wasn't about him at all. It was about her. Her desire to feel something, anything, other than the quiet certainty that had built their life together, the certainty he had given her, and she didn't want it anymore. "Okay," Jake said, his voice steady. The words didn't come with desperation or anger, they were just simple. "If that's what you need, then go. You've made your choice." Sophia stood up almost too quickly, eager to escape the weight of the conversation. "I hope you understand," she said, a weak attempt at reassurance as she pulled her coat around her shoulders. "I'll always care about you. I just think we want different things." But Jake didn't respond. He didn't need to. The words "I'll always care about you" had lost all meaning the moment she decided to walk away. She was already halfway out the door when he stood up, but he made no move to stop her. Sophia walked out of the restaurant, leaving Jake standing in the middle of the dimly lit room. He didn't chase her, didn't beg her to stay. He didn't even call after her. He simply watched the door swing shut behind her, the sound of her heels clicking away on the pavement as if she had never meant anything to him at all. Jake sat back down, the weight of the moment settling in. He wasn't going to beg for her to come back. He wasn't going to let himself fall apart. He knew one thing with absolute certainty: he wasn't boring. But if she couldn't see that, then that was her loss. He'd rebuild. He'd come back better than before, stronger, sharper, more than what she ever thought he could be. As he paid the check and left the restaurant, Jake made a vow to himself. He wouldn't chase her. He would never look back. He would become the version of himself that she never thought possible. And when she saw what she had thrown away, it would already be too late. In that moment he had nothing but time and determination ahead of him, and that was enough. For the first few weeks after the breakup, Jake didn't allow himself to wallow in self-pity. The pain was there, of course. It was impossible to just erase the hurt of being rejected by someone he had loved. But he knew that giving in to despair wasn't going to change anything. What Sophia had done wasn't just a rejection, it was an opportunity. He wasn't about to squander it by sitting around feeling sorry for himself. He was going to prove to her, and more importantly to himself, that he could be more than the man she thought she had outgrown. Jake had always been disciplined. He had built his life on a foundation of consistency, but now that consistency would turn into something sharper, something harder. He wasn't just going to go back to his old routine, he was going to reinvent himself from the inside out. And it started in the one place he had neglected the most: his body. For the first time in years, Jake began hitting the gym regularly. He wasn't looking for instant results. He wasn't trying to become someone else. He simply wanted to become the best version of the man he was. The first few sessions were brutal. His muscles screamed in protest, his body exhausted from years of neglect. But with each drop of sweat, he felt something inside him shift. The physical challenge was a way of showing himself that he could endure, that he could push through the pain, and come out the other side stronger. At the same time, he threw himself into his work with a renewed focus. The business he had started a few years ago was growing, but he knew it could be more. He had always been cautious, playing it safe, but now he took risks. He hired new people, expanded his services, and sought out new partnerships. As his business grew, so did his confidence. Every time he signed a new deal, closed a new project, or made a successful pitch, he felt himself moving further away from the man he had been. He wasn't just succeeding, he was thriving in a way he never had before. The momentum was addictive. And then there was his social life. Jake had never been the life of the party, never the type to fill his calendar with endless dates and late-night hangouts. But something had changed. He started saying yes to more things: nights out with friends, weekend trips, events where he could network and connect. Slowly but surely his circle of acquaintances expanded, and with it, his social confidence grew. People began to notice him in ways they hadn't before. Women took a second glance when he walked into a room. Men saw him as someone to admire, someone who had his act together. He was no longer the guy who had been left behind. He was someone to reckon with. In the months that followed, Jake's transformation became less about physical changes and more about the mindset he cultivated. He stopped caring what Sophia thought. In fact, he stopped thinking about her altogether. The idea of getting her back no longer held any appeal. She had made her choice, and now he was the one who was in control of his future. The more he focused on his own growth, the more he realized that his worth wasn't tied to her approval. It wasn't tied to anyone but himself. Sophia was the last thing on his mind when he booked a trip to Europe to celebrate a milestone in his business. He had reached a level of success he had once only dreamed of, and now he was finally doing things for himself, things he had always put off, waiting for the right time. But there was no right time anymore. The right time was now. When he returned from the trip, the changes were impossible to ignore. Jake was leaner, fitter, and more at ease in his own skin than he had ever been. The man who had once been content to drift along had become a force focused, driven, and unstoppable. He had not only rebuilt himself physically and professionally, but emotionally as well. The sadness that had once clung to him had evaporated, replaced by a quiet, unshakable confidence. Jake's social media had also changed. Where once he had shared candid photos of his quiet life, now there were snapshots from his travels, moments from his business successes, and glimpses into his growing network of friends. He wasn't doing it for anyone's approval, he wasn't trying to show off for Sophia, but rather because he was proud of what he had built. His online presence reflected a life that was rich with possibility, not just in terms of material success, but in terms of the kind of person he had become. Through all of this, there was no grand moment where Jake told himself, "I've made it." He didn't need to. His transformation wasn't about proving something to the world, it was about proving something to himself. He had taken what was once a crushing defeat and turned it into his greatest asset. Each day he woke up stronger, more capable, and more aligned with the man he had always known he could be. And every step he took forward left Sophia and her shallow pursuit of excitement further behind. He was done being defined by her perception. The future was his, and it was only a matter of time before she realized that. Months passed, and Sophia was living the life she had always dreamed of. She had her share of short-term flings, each one promising the kind of excitement she thought she needed. Every night was different, every man more unpredictable than the last. She surrounded herself with people who liked to live on the edge, who made her feel alive in the moment, even if it was only temporary. Yet, despite all the thrills, something was missing. Deep down she could feel it, a quiet discontent she couldn't shake off. The high of the chase was wearing off, and she was left with an unsettling emptiness that none of her whirlwind relationships could fill. She found herself thinking about Jake occasionally, but only in passing. She had long since erased his number from her phone, and she rarely scrolled through his social media, partly because she was convinced that she had made the right choice. He had been boring, after all, steady, dependable, and far too predictable for someone like her. She told herself she had outgrown him, that she was in search of something greater, someone who could keep up with her ever-changing pace. But even as she repeated these thoughts, there was a nagging voice in the back of her mind that wouldn't go away. It wasn't until she ran into Jake, unexpectedly, that the voice turned into a sharp, piercing realization. It happened on an ordinary Friday night, when she was out with a few friends at one of the more popular bars in the city. She was wearing a tight black dress that clung to her figure, her heels clicking on the wood floors with every step she took. The atmosphere was vibrant as usual, full of people laughing, drinking, and mingling. But amidst the noise, something caught her eye. Someone she didn't expect to see. It was Jake. She blinked, unsure if she was seeing things. He stood at the bar, laughing with a group of people, looking completely at ease. His posture was different, confident, even magnetic. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit that made him look even more handsome than she remembered. His hair was neatly styled, and there was a quiet energy around him that was hard to ignore. He wasn't just the same guy she had walked away from. He was different, better. For a moment, Sophia stood frozen, unable to look away. He was a far cry from the man who had once been her safe, predictable anchor. The man who had let her walk out of his life without a word of protest had become someone who commanded attention without even trying. She was struck by how much he had changed, but it was more than just his appearance. It was his presence. Her heart skipped a beat, and before she could stop herself, she found herself walking toward him, her heels clicking sharply as she moved through the crowd. She had to speak to him, to acknowledge what had just happened. She had to see if he'd even recognize her. As she approached, Jake noticed her too. For a brief second, their eyes locked, and she saw something in his gaze, a flicker of recognition, but no warmth. His expression remained neutral, even distant. "Jake?" she said, trying to sound casual, even though her pulse was racing. "Wow, I didn't expect to see you here. You look amazing. Can we catch up?" Jake paused for a moment, his eyes briefly scanning her before he leaned back slightly, a small smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "Sorry, I don't date boring women," he replied, his tone light, but the words hit her like a punch to the stomach. Sophia stood there for a moment, shocked. She had expected something, an embrace, maybe, or an apology, something to ease the awkwardness of their sudden encounter, but instead she was met with cold indifference. Jake wasn't the same man who had once begged for her attention, the man who had been so eager to win her love. He had moved on. Before she could recover from the sting, Jake turned away from her, his attention shifting back to the group he was with. The conversation was over, no more words, no more lingering glances, nothing. She was nothing to him. For the first time, Sophia felt small. The confident, self-assured woman who had left him in pursuit of something better now stood in the shadow of a man she had discarded. The reality hit her hard. Jake hadn't just improved, he had flourished, and in doing so he had completely outgrown her. Her mind raced. How had he done it? How had he gone from the man she thought was too boring to someone who now seemed untouchable? And why hadn't she seen this coming? Sophia looked around the bar. The noise and laughter of the crowd around her suddenly muffled. She wanted to leave, to escape the suffocating realization that she had made a mistake. But as she glanced back toward Jake, she saw him laughing with his friends, and that was when it hit her. She had spent all this time chasing excitement, but it was Jake who had found something real, something meaningful, and now he was beyond her reach. Sophia stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at Jake as he laughed with his friends, completely unaware of the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Her mind raced, but the thoughts came too fast to fully process. He looked so different now, confident, in control, effortlessly charismatic. It was as if the person she had once known had been replaced by someone entirely new. The man she had discarded wasn't just moving on, he had soared, and in the process, had left her behind in a way that felt more final than anything she could have imagined. She tried to shake the unease that gripped her chest, but it refused to loosen its hold. The question that had been quietly tugging at her, the question that had lingered in the back of her mind every time she walked away from a failed fling or a short-term relationship, came roaring to the surface. What did I do? The realization hit her hard. She had traded the stability of someone who had loved her deeply for the fleeting excitement of new, untested relationships. She had told herself that she was looking for something more, something better, but now she wasn't so sure. Jake hadn't just gotten better. He had transcended everything she had once thought he was. He wasn't the boring man she had imagined. He was the man she had needed all along. For a few seconds, the old urge surfaced. An urge to go over to him, to talk to him, to apologize. Maybe they could start over, and this time she would recognize what she had taken for granted. But as she looked at him again, something inside her shifted. She could no longer be the woman who chased after the thrill of the moment. She could see now what she had been blind to before. The truth was, she hadn't just walked away from Jake, she had walked away from herself. She had chased excitement and novelty at the cost of stability, growth, and real connection. She glanced at her phone. There were a few messages from men she had met in the past few weeks, but none of them meant anything to her now. She had been chasing after what exactly? She didn't even know anymore. The carefree adventures, the impulsive trips, the endless dates had all seemed like the answer at one point, but now, standing there in the bar, she realized just how hollow it all was. As she continued to watch Jake, she caught a glimpse of something that made her feel even more insignificant. He wasn't bothered by her presence. He was too busy enjoying his own life to even care about her. It wasn't about anger or bitterness. Jake had simply moved on. The man who had once been so hurt, so unsure of himself, had grown into someone so completely unaffected by her rejection that it was as though she had never existed. Her stomach twisted. She took a deep breath and tried to shake off the bitterness that threatened to overtake her. This wasn't about her anymore, it was about him. Jake had found his own path, and in doing so he had become everything she had been too short-sighted to see. She had thought she was leaving him for something better, but what she had really done was close the door on a future that could have been hers. Sophia tried to refocus, pulling herself together. She couldn't stand there all night watching him. She needed to leave, but before she could take another step, something inside her broke, and she found herself staring at Jake one last time. She had expected to feel anger or regret, but all she felt was emptiness. The reality of what she had lost was too much to bear. As she walked toward the exit, the sting of her own choices seemed to follow her with each step. The bar's loud music faded into the background, and she was left alone in her thoughts, haunted by the truth that Jake was no longer just a part of her past. He was a reminder of everything she had been too blind to appreciate. Sophia's steps were slow as she made her way toward the exit, the weight of the evening pressing down on her shoulders with each passing moment. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and regret. But the worst part was the sinking realization that Jake was no longer a part of her world. The old him, the one who had been so devoted, so patient, was long gone. In his place stood a man who had moved beyond her, someone she could never have again. The sting of that truth was sharper than anything she had felt before. She pushed through the bar's heavy wooden doors, the cold air outside biting at her skin. It was only when she stepped into the night that she realized how much time had passed. The city streets were quieter now, the neon lights casting an eerie glow on the pavement. The thrum of the bar had faded, but the emptiness inside her was deafening. Sophia pulled her phone from her bag, her fingers scrolling absent-mindedly through the messages on her screen. There were a couple from the men she had been seeing recently, their texts casual, unimportant, a reminder of how little real connection she had made since Jake. It was all surface level, like she had been filling the spaces in her life with distractions, pretending to herself that the rush of a new fling could replace the steady, grounded love she had once shared with him. She stopped in front of a street lamp and stared at her phone. One message in particular caught her eye, a text from her latest exciting date. It was short, to the point, and chilling in its simplicity. "Sorry, can't make it tonight, something came up." Her stomach dropped as she read it again, the emptiness of the words echoing the emptiness she felt inside. It wasn't the first time she had been cancelled on, it wouldn't be the last, but in that moment it felt like the final nail in her coffin. The man who had stood by her, who had been there when things got hard, who had loved her without hesitation, was gone. In his place, there was nothing but a string of failed relationships, empty conversations, and a growing sense of disillusion. Sophia looked up at the street around her, her breath fogging in the cool air, and then her gaze shifted back toward the bar. There, through the windows, she could see Jake still laughing with his friends. He was so at ease, so comfortable in his own skin that it was almost painful to watch. She had walked away from him, convinced she could do better, convinced that the world had more to offer. But now, as she stood there, everything she had believed in felt like a lie. For a moment, her body seemed to freeze. Her thoughts went back to the man she had once known, the man she had discarded for being too boring. And yet now, it was she who seemed stuck, trapped in the shallow pursuit of things that never lasted, of thrills that always faded. She realized too late that Jake hadn't just transformed physically or professionally, he had grown in ways she could never have imagined. His quiet strength, his resilience, his ability to move on without looking back, it all felt so foreign to her now. She had underestimated him. She had dismissed him as boring, but in reality, he was the only one who had built something real. Sophia turned away from the bar, feeling the weight of the evening's epiphany pressing down on her. She couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the damage she had done, but as she walked away into the cold night, She couldn't shake the feeling that everything had finally come full circle. She had been looking for excitement, for something more. And now, she had nothing to show for it. The life she had built with distractions and empty relationships had crumbled under the weight of its own shallowness. She glanced back one last time toward the bar, her eyes catching Jake's figure. He didn't see her, didn't even look in her direction. To him, she was just another face in the crowd, an ex who had no place in his world anymore. As she continued down the street, her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from another of her fleeting, exciting dates. The text read, "You up for something tonight?" Sophia stared at it for a long time, but the words felt hollow. She knew exactly what this kind of message meant. She knew exactly what she was chasing, and for the first time, it didn't matter. She had spent so much of her life chasing the wrong things, running after empty moments, that she had lost sight of what really mattered. And then, without even thinking, she deleted the message, swiping it away as if it had never existed. She was done with the lies, done with pretending that the thrill of something new could replace the steady warmth of something real. She couldn't go back to Jake, and she knew that now. He had moved on. He had found his path, his peace, and it was too late for her to join him. Jake, as she had come to realize, had already won, not by any grand gesture, but by simply living his life. The victory was in his transformation, in his quiet success. And Sophia? She was left standing in the aftermath. The sting of her own decisions, the only thing she could hold on to. The finality of it hit her all at once. As she walked into the night, her past and future felt irreconcilable. The man who had once been her world was now a stranger, and the woman she had been before no longer existed.